few announcements. Rolling.
Just today we're gonna have a little review after around 2:30 for any questions, and I have some pictures for practice, kind of, sort of, and
In the computer lab?
in the step lab, yes, sir. So, and then if y'all have any other times that, like, if you can't make the 2:30, you can always text me and we can work something out and figure it out. But yeah, 2:30.
Awesome. All right. Second order of business. Dr. Petrie is a friend of mine. I knew him when he was working at Tri-City Physical Therapy, and he got hired to oversee LSU Shreveport's Lafayette campus. So they're starting a cohort here in Lafayette under the LSU Shreveport name for physical therapy. And so I emailed the class the link to basically like information sign up. Usually the first programs of any type are the easiest to get into because no one knows about them yet. So that's kind of cool that they're going to have it. You would graduate in Shreveport, but all of your time would be spent in Lafayette. It's just under the umbrella of LSU. All right, you guys. Today we're going to start about the scapula. I always like to use analogies, especially if it's stuff you've spent time looking and learning before. So in other words, comparatively similarities. And then we can look at the differences. If you can see what they have in common, it's a lot easier to work off of what they don't have in common. So let's take a look at our pelvis to start off with. And I just want you to notice that our pelvis is a lower extremity version of our scapula. They're not the same, but they're similar. Like just like an arm is similar, a humerus is similar to a feet. They're not the same, but they're as close to a version of an upper extremity and lower extremity bone. Hands, feet, kind of stuff, right? So the pelvis, one of the things the pelvis does is it helps our functional circle of step. So what I mean by that is if I were to reach forward and flex my hip to heel strike, if I'm trying to step a little bit further, my pelvis can transverse rotate. In essence, the right side does this and the left side does this, and I can increase my step. It's not that extreme when we do it, we're not, but it's subtle, but it does happen. When you swing, your pelvis is rotating transversely to help get you a little bit further. Think about lifting your leg up. If you abducted your hip, your leg can only go so high with just hip motion. But if I laterally pelvic girdle rotate, literally reposition the entire socket, everything goes along for the ride, and I can get my leg a heck of a lot higher than if I just did this by itself. However, my left side, to be able to go up, my right side has to come down. In other words, the pelvis has to work together as a block in order to help me reposition the socket to get a little higher or to get a little bit further. Okay. Scapula is really cool because scapula is two independent sides of the pelvis. In other words, they are not connected. They don't have to work together. They can work independent. It would literally be what could happen if I wanted to raise my left hip and only the left side of my pelvis did its part. In other words, instead of this right and left lateral pelvic girdle rotation, what could happen if I could just do this? And we're going to have a name for that because the scapula can just do this. What would be a name for, instead of for the pelvis and the transverse, we have to have both sides doing this? What could happen if just one side could just do this? Does that kind of make sense? Instead of both sides doing this, what could happen if just one side could do this? So scapular motion, even though it's going to be new words and it's going to be a lot different, it's really just how our upper extremity has more motion capabilities independent of each other. Right side, left side independent, versus in the pelvis, they're kind of tied together by being connected to the sacroiliac. Okay? So when we say pelvic girdle, we're looking down here, like a block, like a basketball, pouring the water out, however you like to identify. When we talk about shoulder girdle, it's a similar concept, but now we have the right side and the left side as independent things. Okay? There are 4 articulations of the shoulder girdle. 2 of them are going to be important for this class. I've got to touch upon all of them. Your sternoclavicular joint. That's literally where your upper extremity connects to your thorax, where your collarbone connects to your manubrium right here. Sternoclavicular joint. So here's your clavicle, your collarbone. That connects to your scapula at the acromioclavicular joint. The acromion is part of your scapula. It's that hook part right here, connected to the scapula. Those 2, based off of what you choose to do in grad school, are very important, for injuries and palpations and range of motions. For our class, the 2 joints that are really important for us in terms of significant motion are our shoulder joint proper, the glenohumeral joint, right? The ball and socket. That's the one that we're going to have flexions and extensions, just like the hip. Same motions. And then the other one is the uniqueness that our upper extremity version of the pelvis, our scapula, can independently orbit and move about the ribs. And we call that the scapulothoracic articulation. So what I want you to notice is sternoclavicular joint. There's a water balloon capsule. Bone moves about bone, traditionally axis and planes. Acromioclavicular joint. Glenohumeral joint. Scapulothoracic articulation. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. It literally is how the scapula is moving, floating about the ribs. There's no water balloon joint capsule. There's no one. It's very generalized motion. But it's how the scapula floats and moves and orbits about the rib cage to help us keep more functional motion. I'll give you a few silly examples, because I always learn best with silly examples. I'll try and do it for the side. If I flexed my left hip and I said, how can I get my foot a little bit further? I'd have no choice but to have like right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. In other words, my right hip has to do something so that my left hip could go forward. But if I did that with my left shoulder, my right shoulder doesn't have to do anything. I can literally just move the left scapula to help my hand go forward. Just like I would have here. But for the pelvis, the whole thing's got to swing to get that extra movement, right? To reposition the socket. I could do it independently with my left. I could do it independently with my right. I can go back and forth. You can't do that with your pelvis. Pelvis kind of has to go together, right? I'd have to crack open the shell. So that's what we have up here. So look at all of that extra motion, your scapula. That's all scapula. That's a lot of extra motion that we get forward and back, up and down. There's a lot of motion that we get from the scapula literally repositioning our shoulder joints. There's going to be 6 motions you guys are going to have to be accountable for the scapula. I'm going to show you what they look like. Note, I said this at one of the first class periods. Cat minute. Sometimes people will refer to the same motions as different names. It happens. We have to be on the same page of what we call it so there's no confusion. So just know, when I say this is what we're going to call it, it's no disrespect to someone who calls it something else. It's just sometimes there's a lot of facets words with it, and we have to settle on how we're going to reference it. So check it out. So you see how the scapula functionally are either going towards the spine or away from the spine. So my scapula can float about my rib cage, and they can go towards the spine, away from the spine. These motions we refer to as retraction and protraction. And the way my brain sees it is if your scapula floats about your ribs, where like your shoulder girdle is coming forward, how you see forward, that's like progress, moving forward, going forward, progress, protraction. And then retraction, you think about retracting a bow, retraction of the bow. But this is about functional circles. This is about allowing your hands to go further back than what your glenohumeral joint will allow by itself. Being able to reach back further than you normally would, because literally the whole shoulder joint can float with the scapula to get back there, or going across more than you normally could because your scapula can float across this one. Protraction of the right scapula, retraction of the right scapula. If this was a pelvic girdle, it would have to look something like this. This is kind of silly. Let's see if I can even do it. Right transverse pelvic girdle. Notice how the left one goes forward and the right one goes back. So the scapula would have to look something like this, like so being able to independently let one side go forward is very useful for as much work we do with our hands. But it's a similar concept. Forward, back, forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. It's a similar concept. It's just we can do it independently. So protraction and retraction. Think about doing a bench press or a push-up, and you get some extra motion that's happening at your scapula that's not necessarily shoulder. It's all scapular motion. That makes sense? Okay. The next one, so we have the forward and back flow for the forward and back orbit. I like to look at it as orbiting the ribs because your heart's like the sun, and the scapula is kind of orbiting like a planet. I just think that's kind of cool. Remember where it's at. All right, then we got the up and down orbit. The up and down orbit. I think this one's the easiest because elevator, right? Up. So elevation of the scapula is when you need help getting your hands or your shoulders a little bit higher. So elevation of the scapula. Think about you're reaching for something, and if your scapula didn't help you, this is all you can get. Scapula gets you a lot further. And as a lot of you that play sports, sometimes it's a game of inches. Life and death could be a game of inches. Functional circle could be a game of inches. So getting up a little bit higher, literally the scapula being able to, this is the version of this. Being able to hike that hip up higher. But for me to do this one also has to do something. My scapula is independent. I can raise this one up, and this one doesn't have to go down. I can bring them both up. It's a very unique feature of independent sides. Okay? Elevation, depression. Lindsay, confirm this with me. Or don't. What is this exercise called? You take a couple of dumbbells. I'll do something realistic. Let's just pretend I get some 100-pound dumbbells. Or I'm joking. I have 15-pound dumbbells. And I do this. What do we call that exercise? You can be honest. So what do you usually put before shrug? Shoulder shrugs. Can you see the potential problem there? So our shoulders, as we're going to see when we do our hips, our shoulders can flex, extend, adduct, internally, external, rotate. There is no shrug in there. And if the shoulder were to go up and down as a joint, it would have to look like this. This is the ball. This is my humerus. This is my socket of my scapula. This would be a shoulder shrug. It's going along for the ride. In other words, it would be just as arbitrary to say elbow shrugs. It's going up and down. Or wrist shrugs. I mean, they're going up and down too, right? So it's another example how, at no fault of people who lift, you got to call them something, but sometimes those words get etched into our brains. So the shrugs is really your scapula elevating and depressing, and the shoulder joint is just going along for the ride. Does that make sense? That is going to be a test question. Giving you a heads up. So what's the opposite of elevation? Depression. You get to upward downward rotation set. So elevation, and that is depression. So depression, like if you're trying to reach down, you got to go a little bit further down. Depression of the scapula, elevation of the scapula. You're carrying something like a bucket. You may be more inclined to elevate to help bring it across. Depression, elevation, depression of the scapula. We typically don't have as much depression options from anatomical, just because our neck muscles are relatively developed. But I'll show you an example of depression. Has anybody ever seen the tribes that have like the long necks? Their necks aren't longer. It's just with those rings, it constantly depresses their scapula, and they atrophy the muscles that are usually pulling the scapula up. So as those neck muscles atrophy, you see the neck in its normal size. It's just our traps and stuff kind of hide that. So just an example of the potential for depression, but our musculature doesn't allow for activities. They can't, at that level, they can't take those rings off because their neck muscles wouldn't be able to support their head. This just goes to show you the potential for scapular depression. All right, guys, the last one that I want to show you visually is, bless you. How would, if I'm trying to raise my leg up, let's say I was in martial arts and was trying to kick up, which with my limited range of motion, it's not a lot of up. My pelvis could do right lateral, and notice my left side would raise up to help and the right side would go down, because again, it's blocked. What if I could get my left leg higher and I don't have to do anything to my right side? And that's the next one. And that is upward rotation of the scapula. So think about it. If we did this analogy here, bringing this side and rotating it, I didn't just bring it straight up. I rotated it so that, see if this works. If I just brought it up, but by doing this, it helps. Here's a better one. This is what's happening. Let's say I can only abduct my hip. Comme ça. By rotating globally, like a global clock, right? I could get it higher. So when I do this pelvic girdle rotation, notice how this is rotating to reposition to get it higher. That's what my scapula does. When I go to bring my arms up, your scapula will upwardly rotate to help get you to 12 o'clock. When you have your hands over your head, that's not all motion at the shoulder joint. the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, gets you about 120 degrees there. So here's 90, here's about 120. All of this extra motion that you think you have at your shoulder is really your scapula upwardly rotating, repositioning the socket so that you can get your hand globally above your head. Upward rotation of the scapula, downward rotation of the scapula. It's a cheat code. To me, this is the best way to explain it. Let's see, let's watch it move for a little bit, and then I'll try to explain. Upward, downward. Okay. So, the clock hand is the humerus. This is the glenohumeral joint, shoulder joint. 6, 9. See, let's say my glenohumeral joint could get me to about 10 o'clock. A little bit past that. In order for my hand to go up all the way, now it happens in rhythm. It blends together. That's why it's really hard to see. But in order to get my hand at 12 o'clock, I literally have to move the clock to get my hand over the top of my head. Literally, my clock has to move so that globally I can get my clock hand at 12. Globally. That's scapula upward rotation. That's how we do it. Our scapula literally, because the socket is on the scapula, right? There's the socket, glenoid fossa. Hopefully from biology lab, you guys remember that? It's the little golf tee that the golf ball sits on, as I was taught. So if you got this much motion and you need to get up a little higher, it makes sense if I reposition the golf tee. Globally, I could get to where I need to be. So, how will we differentiate between elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, and upward and downward rotation? Questions that will have upward and downward rotation for the scapula will include shoulder motion. What I mean by that, I just spent 5 minutes explaining how the clock hand and the clock work together to get your arm up over. You don't need elevation and depression to do that. My clock elevation and depression is like this. Protraction and retraction is like this. Okay? Upward and downward rotation, I need the clock hand to be trying to go up so that my clock can rotate and help me get above my head. So any questions that involve scapula upward rotation are going to involve shoulder motion, bringing your hands up. That make sense? Do some practicing. Lindsay, can I borrow you for a second? Okay, face the
Do you need to?
we did this all. You know, like plus schedule. All right. So here is Lindsay's left scapula. There's her right scapula. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my hands to represent her scapula, and we're going to see kind of how they move. So let's do just your right. Elevate and go up. You see, the left one doesn't have to do anything. Again, it's not like a pelvis where both of them have to go along for the ride. I can independently come back out. Elevation and depression. One more time. And notice when she elevates, the shoulder joint goes along for the ride, but that doesn't mean there was shoulder motion at the glenohumeral joint. Does that make sense? Because when she go down, when she elevates, guess what else goes along for the ride? Her elbow, like everything attached to it is going along for the ride. Okay, down. Okay, let's do bilateral elevation. See what that looks like. Bilateral depression. One more time. Elevation. Depression. Okay. Now let's go retraction. So this is bilateral scapular retraction. Okay. Okay. Protraction. Retraction. Okay, now let's just do one at a time. Right scapular retraction. Right shoulder protraction. Retraction. Protraction. Okay, left scapular retraction. Protraction. Retraction. Good. Right shoulder. So you see, they can be independent of each other because you may need one hand to go forward and you may need the other to go back. All right, now let's show them the magic of upward rotation. So this is the bottom triangle of the scapula. Okay. Slowly abduct your arms. And come back down. Now watch this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to limit Lindsay's scapula. Basically, I'm going to say, scapula, I know you're used to helping, but I'm going to put a boot on your car, and you won't be able to help get the shoulder up. Okay. So watch this health line. Okay. Now notice I'm not pushing on your shoulder, right? I'm not pushing on your humerus. I'm just keeping your scapula from upwardly rotating and elevating. It's weird, huh? Do both at the same time. It's all scapula. Scapula contributes a lot, but we don't necessarily see it because we attribute it all to shoulder. But remember, our hip is well protected. We have our biggest, strongest muscles down here. We have an extra ligaments up here, a big, thick socket. The shoulder socket is literally like a golf tee. So to put all of that motion there would even be worse for joint stability. So being able to give some of that motion with the scapula basically makes our arms more functional, a little bit longer forward, a little bit longer out, a little bit higher up. Okay? Makes a difference, huh? Mm-hmm. All right. So what we can do now is let's do a little lab. You don't have to, but I encourage it. And Lindsay, I'd like for you to float around in case anybody's shy. What we just did with Lindsay, where you find a partner. If you don't have a partner, I'll be your partner. Lindsay will be your partner. But being able to feel and see the scapula go up and down, forward and back, and then the rotation, I think, is a really good way to literally see how that scapula is contributing to our function. All right? Let's take about 10 minutes and we'll make sure we try to develop these scapular motions. So like another illusion, baseball's about to start, they're having spring training. And so they'll use global terms. And like I said, I have no problem using global terms. My students need to know what global means and that we move locally. But a global term of delivery angle. So like someone might pitch and they throw sidearm, or someone might throw overhead, or someone may throw 3/4, but that's a global reference. If I'm going to throw overhead, guys, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to be here, and then I can reposition my clock hand by moving other clocks. Like literally, I can lean my trunk. I could get my shoulder higher by tilting my scapula, yeah. But I could also get my hand higher by just right bending my trunk. I could get my hand higher by right laterally rotating my pelvis. Like you have a lot of different ways to do function. And so if you ever freeze someone throwing here, notice that really they're here. And they just reposition another clock with the illusion that it's over the top. It is over the top. Globally, but locally, we're here because throwing it as far away from our axis as possible means it's going to go fast. It's a leverage thing with mechanics. Okay, so it's very similar. Our scapula, just like you can see that if I lean to my right, my arm goes higher. Take that concept and do this with it, and it's the same concept. All right, Lindsay, what kind of practice we can give with the scapula? What you think?
Or like,
Do some exercises. Start off. All right. Something like this. All right. How could the scapula most contributes to me letting you see what the heck I'm talking? As we analyze motion joint by joint, there's a lot of stuff happening. No problem. We just got to take it one joint at a time. We haven't talked about elbow yet, I guess on the first test. So we could do left elbow flexion. I haven't taught you about the wrist yet. We haven't talked about shoulder yet, although you can figure that out. But let's look at scapula. How could his scapula contribute to helping to get that dumbbell as high as possible? Left scapula, what? Retraction. Left scapular retraction. Absolutely. Guys, look at I want you to, is anybody planning on lifting back today? About yesterday? Okay, I want you to go back in time and then try this trick. I'm joking. Next time. Think of this. We have a lot of big muscles that influence our scapula. Maybe not me, but most people do. And what's easier or what's harder if you're moving furniture? The hardest part is because of friction when you're trying to push an entertainment system or a couch or sofa. The hardest part is getting it going. It's not as hard to keep it going. Do you know what I mean by that? Once you have it moving, inertia is that initial. So in something like this, if you're doing like, say, a bent over row, and you're like, okay, practically speaking, globally speaking, The game is make dumbbell come up. Global reference, go up. And so you're like, okay, well, how could I contribute to that? One way is to contribute by getting it moving with using just my scapula. That no shoulder motion at all. Just the retraction of the scapula made the dumbbell come up several inches. And it got the furniture moving, so that way my shoulder motion can just keep it moving. It's a heck of a lot easier to move something once it's already moving. So what I'm saying is that I'm disrespecting the shoulder. I'm saying give props to how much the scapula contributes to bringing the dumbbell up globally. That's all scapula. So next time you do, to me, one way that I suggested this, so I did it when I used to live now in Hole, but separate scapula from shoulder. We as humans, we have a tendency to do them together. We do scapula and shoulder stuff together because they're two knobs of the Etch-a-Sketch, practically speaking, that are allowing us to do what we do. Separate them. Separate them so that you can start to practice. All right, when I do the row, scapula retraction, now shoulder extension, elbow flexion. Shoulder flexion, elbow extension, scapula protraction. It's a good way to kind of practice giving unto Caesar what is Caesar's, as George used to say. So retraction going up, protraction coming down. Okay, what about I'm gonna do one on here because I'm not doing really good finding stuff. What if I did this motion? Turn the radio. A to B, B to C. Or I'll do the same thing on the ground. Maybe it'll be easier for everybody to see. A to B, B to C. Now again, it gets hidden when you work in the shoulders with the scapula. But when you stop the shoulder, and you can see the contribution of the scapula. This is your first lesson in illusions. Because protraction, hands go forward. Well, what if your hands are fixed and they can't go forward? You can still have protraction, but your torso is going to go up, back. Does that make sense? So when I pushed and my thorax came up, this would be protraction, retraction, protraction, retraction. Does that make sense? All right, here's another tricky one that I just thought of. I'm still exhausted. Tracy challenged me to a jiu-jitsu match last night, my oldest son, and man, I'm glad I have 50 pounds on, so I was smoked. And I don't do jiu-jitsu. So I had that going against me. All right, guys, if you look at things the way I've constantly been teaching you to look at things. We don't assume. Don't assume does not mean overthink. Don't assume just means let me analyze where the person starts, where they are, what's their position, the new position, and then use my skills to figure out what happened. Let's have a scapular conversation. An up-down scapular conversation. He starts on the left and he lowers his body down. But what motion, majority motion, would have happened in the scapula? Don't answer it yet. Give it some thought. Say anything? Sure. Let's analyze the contribution of the scapula for him to go down and up for the dip. We don't care about shoulder. Don't care about elbow. Yeah, it's just we're not having those conversations. We're just looking at how the scapula could contribute to bringing him up and lowering him down. For the most part, this exercise, his center of mass is going up and down. Sure. So how could the scapula contribute to getting him a little bit further down and a little bit higher up? We're going to start with left to right, and then we'll go right to left. Left to right was bilateral scapula elevation. See that? And from right to left would actually be depression. Here's the illusion. Cap and bottle. If all you were taught is that elevation means the scapula going up and down, then when we fix the scapula and move the thorax, it's going to mess with you. Yeah. Watch. I'll do it over here in case someone's in the witness protection program and want to out you. Watch, guys. Elevation. Depression. Elevation. Depression. Elevation. Depression. Fixed moving. Fixed moving. That's what it amounts to. Oh, I'm not disrespecting the retraction. It's just we're reserving the retraction for forward and back contributions. So it's which scapular contribution can help you up and down. So I'm not disrespecting the retraction, especially since he's kind of tilting his body. But the majority of the help that the scapular gave it is in the up and back. We're good? All right. Last ones, because I know these examples are very important to you guys. Last ones. And I'm not going to give you time. We'll just talk about it, okay? So let's look at something like what they call a lat pull down. And I'll show you how this can mess with it. So on the lat pull down, I feel like I'm trying to diffuse the ball 4 minutes left. Scapular contribution. Downward rotation and probably some depression when you bring it down. And then when you bring the bar up, some elevation and some upward rotation. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Where our brains get messed up, make a note of this. Verbally or literally. For the lat pull down, literally bringing the bar down, downward rotation, depression. But what if I flip the script and instead of moving hands about a fixed thorax, we have a movable thorax about fixed hands? Does everybody see where I'm going with this? So for this one, you actually have downward rotation and depression when you actually pull yourself up. It's no different than the dip illusion. What's that? Of your scapula, yeah. Yeah. Your scapula has to pull down on the fixed hands in order to make your thorax go up. But the reason we call it, we stay with the same motions, because it gets you to the same place. And all of our movements are named with the most traditional. Smaller pieces usually move above bigger pieces. So our ankle motion, our knee motion, our hip motion, our cervical motion, it's just that in biomechanics, the small door always moves above the big wall, so we name it open, close. In biomechanics, our bodies, we can move big pieces about small pieces. It messes with our brains because it's different global spins. But if I start in a place and I end in the same place, those things have to be called the same thing. I think one of my first analogies I gave in class, if we're playing Monopoly or a board game, I go forward 3 spaces because that's usually what happens. But technically, I can move the board back and still get to the same place. So therefore, I have to say I move forward 3 spaces. Y'all remember that analogy? Okay. So for the pull up, bringing yourself up, downward rotation, depression, lowering yourself down, upward rotation and elevation. What's going to mess with you is that lat pull down has the same motions as pull up. But one has the word down in it, and the other has the word up in it. Because in one, you're pulling your hands down, and the other one, you're pulling your body up. But it's the same motions. Layman's terms. Good? All right, guys, I enjoyed today. I hope y'all have a great Wednesday.